in any fandom, there is a subset of people which I think can most charitably be described as smartasses. For this case, we'll call them Jeremys, after perhaps the most famous smartass on the internet. These are the kinds of people who will ask questions of like, oh, why don't they just beam a photon torpedo into the Borg cube? Why don't they just run away from the Borg? They walk. Why don't they just go up the stairs to avoid the Daleks? Stuff like that. And that really brings up a point. There is in fact such a thing as a stupid question. Generally, they are best ignored. In the case of Star Wars, Rian Johnson didn't ignore a stupid question. In fact, he went and gave us hyperspace ramming. This particular scene, like I say, was visually stunning. It was perhaps one of the most impressive set pieces in the film. It was also completely universe-breaking. There's all sorts of ways you could amend hyperspace ramming. You say, oh, it was the precise distance at which it was between the Star Destroyers and the cruiser, which meant that, you know, it was still in real space when it hit them, but it was also accelerated. Whatever. Stupid stuff. Some have asked this same question regarding the world of Trek. And, well, today I'm going to explain why warp ramming in Trek doesn't work. Partially, I do have something of a personal motive to do this. That's because the original beta canon story for the Tomed incident involved a Romulan ship warp ramming a planet. And then, for some reason, the Federation say, oh, well, we better give up our cloaking devices. Which is, of course, just completely silly and absurd. So, yes, I have my own personal reasons for why I don't like warp ramming, and why I think it shouldn't be allowed to work in the universe of Trek, which I think does give us plenty of reasons why it won't work. So, without any further ado, let's get into it. So, first things first, let's discuss the mechanics of warp ramming. Now, the theory is mass times velocity equals potential energy, or mass times acceleration / deceleration equals force. So essentially what the basic calculus is big mass times going very, very, very fast. The thing is that that's not actually the case, because when you're in warp, the rules of real space don't apply to you. Now, impulse ramming is a completely separate thing, and that is probably a little bit more viable. I'm not going to cover the mechanics of sublight ramming, real space ramming here. Frankly, it will probably require someone who knows a damn sight more about physics than me. But when you're in warp, you're not acting like you are in real space. The normal rules of the universe don't apply to you when you're at warp speed. Quite obviously, you're at warp speed. You are breaking the rules of the universe. So the way this balances out is that for a ship to be at warp, as far as the rest of the universe is concerned, a ship at warp is not this gigantic mass of several million metric tons travelling faster than the speed of light, because that just simply doesn't work. It can't happen. So instead, a ship at warp has no mass. It is effectively a string of faster-than-light particles, like tachyons, but effectively it's some kind of faster-than-light particle. It's a string of faster-than-light particles. That is what a ship travelling at warp is to the rest of the universe. So when you impact something, you're not going to impact it as a solid object with mass. You're instead going to impact it as a energy pulse, which is, basically going to be absorbed by a ship's shields. That's exactly what they're designed to do. So, yeah, you're not going to do particularly large amounts of damage when you're basically a compressed stream of energy. There's also another problem, which is because you have no mass, you have no inertia. So it's very easy for you to be deflected. And navigational deflectors exist precisely to do that. They exist to stop ships running into faster-than-light particles or other subatomic particles that may damage the ship at warp, and they move these things aside. Presumably, navigational deflectors also have a passive effect on other ships also travelling at warp, so that warp speed collisions just don't happen, because they'll just deflect off one another. So if you try to ram an enemy ship head-on at warp, which is the most efficient way of doing it, because of course that's then you're coming one way, they're coming the other way. That gives you the most potential energy, but a navigational deflector is just going to prevent you from ever making contact with that ship. So, okay, you say, well, that's fine, we'll attack the ship from side on. So, obviously, when we're talking about warp speeds, that's incredibly hard to make. Like, that's a very difficult hit to calculate. Space is vast, they're going to see you coming, and if they make any kind of course adjustment, you are going to miss by a significant magnitude. Finally, you have the other option of, well, I'll decelerate just before impact. Okay, well now, if you're attacking another ship travelling at warp, now they are an energy stream. Now, it's theoretically possible that they could hit you, but it's a 1 in a trillion, and again, they have the advantage. And also, it's worth pointing out that decelling before impact will also just take away any benefit of doing a warp ram, because, well, you're back to impulse. So you're at whatever your impulse speed was prior to going to warp, and that's the amount of damage you're going to be doing. So even there, you're not going to be doing a huge amount of damage, or certainly no more than if you were just engaged in sublight ramming. So these are the problems with warp ramming. First of all, you're not actually as powerful as you think. You're easily evaded and deflected as well, and your chances of actually getting a hit are very small. But you know what, let's indulge this a little further, shall we? Let's see if we can design a warp anti-ship missile. Okay, so to design an effective theoretical warp missile, it must be faster and more maneuverable than any target it must attack. It must attack that target from either the side or the rear. It must decelerate at the last moment, and therefore it must be undetectable, and therefore you can tell what technologies this is going to involve. And we will immediately run into the practicalities of cost issues. So you require, for this warp missile, a top-line engine and power plant. You require sophisticated computer systems that possibly have to be hardened against electronic warfare. You need a top-of-the-line cloaking device to prevent yourself from being detected while traveling at very high speeds, all of which you can only get the benefit of once. You get one use of this, and that's it. Now, I know someone is going to say, well, isn't a warp core like a giant torpedo? Well, a steam boiler is technically a giant pressure bomb. Doesn't mean that ships in the age of ironclads were slinging steam boilers at each other, although that might have been quite amusing. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a good weapon. Remember that in a photon torpedo, the reaction chamber in a photon torpedo only has to work once. A warp core's reaction chamber has to work all the time, and so there is magnitudes of difference in the cost of these two items. It's genuinely like, well, how much is a stick of TNT? How much is a nuclear reactor? You know, it's that level of difference between a photon torpedo and an actual warp core. So they are not the same thing. Warp cores are extremely expensive, and especially a warp core that would be capable of powering a high-speed warp missile. Cloaking devices are very expensive. Computers are very expensive. And if you took all these high-spec pieces of equipment and mounted them on just a normal starship, you'd get a very good top-of-the-line starship that would probably give you a better return on investment, as you can use it, well, for years and years and years and years. You can use it for as long as you want, as long as you have people to fly it. Whereas, of course, a warp missile, you can only use it once. And so it's fair to say that warp missiles are extremely uneconomical. And yes, economy does matter in the 24th century. Just because they've eliminated modern sort of capitalism doesn't mean that there isn't a constraint on resources or the production of certain things. Okay, so let's say theoretically you've gone and you've built yourself a nice high-tech, hypersonic, hyperwarp missile, and you've taken out an enemy starship. Okay, what then? What do you do then? So you use a warp missile, you've destroyed the enemy ship. Well, what now? because you'll need another system to exploit any advantage gained by destroying that starship. You'd need some kind of sensor nearby to even see the starship. If you were firing this warp missile from standoff range, you'll need something else to actually see the target to know it's there. It's just as costly to supply and support these missiles as it is a fleet of starships, and these starships are designed to blow up and are only really good for one thing. So it doesn't really generate value for you. It doesn't really give you anything for the investment that you put into it, other than just the denial of the enemy's value, the destruction of enemy equipment. But it doesn't do anything for you. You've just spent a whole lot of money on this very, very expensive missile. This is why perhaps this is an interesting caveat over to current day. There's this big talk right now about hypersonic naval missiles, and they're just gonna wipe out the American Carrier Task Group. And I do wonder, I don't know because I don't know, but I do wonder if actually the whole bubble of speculation around that has kind of been burst by the Ukrainians deploying the naval drones, which are effectively modernized torpedoes. They are just whitehead torpedoes. I mean, they're not whitehead torpedoes, but the concept, and in terms of what they do, and in terms of their effect on how navies of the world will be thinking, they're basically torpedoes. It's the whitehead torpedo all over again. And I think, to an extent, that's kind of something we should take into account when looking at this kind of technology. This is very expensive, high investment, headline technology. This is the cutting edge stuff. And it's quite possible that a system like a warp missile could be quite easily countered by, I don't know, something really basic and simple compared to this headline grabbing technology. I mean, how many ships have been sunk by hypersonic cruise missiles? How many ships have been sunk by naval drones? That's another thing to take into account, is that potentially there's other technologies that would be just as effective, if not more effective, than this particular weapon system, but would also not cost you stupid amounts of money. So just to wrap things up, warp ramming isn't an effective tactic. For you to even make it work in the universe of Star Trek, it's actually very difficult, because the universe of Star Trek, it knows very well its own technobabble and its own rules, and so it's got embedded in those rules defenses against such things. The only way to implement warp ramming in a way that would be effective would be incredibly expensive. And thirdly, it's of very limited strategic value. Yes, you've blown up the enemy ship. Congratulations. You may have punched a hole in their patrol perimeter. Well, what are you going to do now? Oh, we're going to have to send a ship through. Couldn't you have just used a cloak-equipped ship to penetrate enemy defenses? The way the universe of Star Trek works means that you're just most of the time far better off using a starship to accomplish a wide variety of tasks than a hyper-specialized warp missile. And so I think it's fair to say that with regards to Trek, some modern tech just doesn't translate. Like I say, even with the modern naval drone, I don't know if there's necessarily a one-to-one translation within Star Trek, at least that we have seen yet. I suppose the closest thing you could say would be the Texas class from Lower Decks. Although that's a bit more general purpose still, isn't it? It's not necessarily tactical, although it does have considerable capabilities in that respect. But that is just to say that, yeah, some technologies or modern technologies don't always translate one-to-one into the world of Star Trek, much like with remote piloted drones. The rules of communication in Star Trek actually mean that these are not practical, or of very limited value, because you've got time delay and, yeah, you're not getting around that when it comes to the vast distances involved in Trek. At least if you want to stick to any kind of scientific realism. To cut a long story short, those are my thoughts on warp ramming in Trek and why it simply doesn't work, and why it should not be allowed to work. And so we do not fall into the same pit as Star Wars did. So, thank you all for watching. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and I will see you all in the next video. Special thanks to now over 100 members for supporting the channel. My glorious Navarks, Tully DT, Urella, Macross Shaffer, Sean Farrell, and Zaylan Maru. My ever-dutiful commanders, Philip Ty, Birdmonster, Jeff Hallam, Mark Philippe, Khan Strider, Gabe Logan, Adam Bowman, Nicholas Walsh, Martin McConville, JC Tech Wizard, Alcara Dreamer, Gloom Cookie, Der Monarch, Jamal Soto, and Tin Alt. And I salute my Centurions, Pendlebury, Marcus Hall, Julian Arnott, Freedom Trooper, Oculcatum Questo, John Nicol, Athis Collection, Tobias Klein, Marzarine, Bird of Play D3, Khan the Skektal Overlord, David Jackson, Guy Haslam, Quentin King, Shipmaster, and Valletta Petra Siren. And I thank all my loyal sub-lieutenants. Thank you all for supporting the channel, and I will see you all in the next video.